There's no silver bullet, it's a combination of efforts and it's a moving target. We constantly have to be adaptive. We constantly have to sort of try and get ahead of the game, and looking at it at a sort of a population level and not an individual level is really, really important for the long-term success here.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World, and I'm here with Don Jooste from an unbelievable organisation called African Parks, which was founded in the year 2000 and which works in partnership with governments and local communities across Africa, in some of the most difficult countries in Africa, to resurrect their national park systems and to put in place proper conservation and rewilding. And a lot of what African Parks does is kind of really just ambitious to the point of being almost nuts. I'm just blown away by their newsletters and the stories that come out of that organization of what they're doing. And perhaps the most extraordinary thing they're doing is rewilding nearly 2,000 rhinos, which is equal to 15% of the total population of white rhinos. So Don here is in charge of that program, and I'm really, really excited to have you on the podcast, Don. Thank you. So I want to just talk straight away about Platinum Farms. And when I first read the news that African Parks was going to be taking over a failing rhino farm with 2,000 rhinos, and that African Parks would be taking those rhinos and spreading them across the continent of Africa into newly protected areas, I was staggered to know that there was a farm with 2,000 rhinos in it. Like, how did that come about? What was Platinum Farms?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, obviously a good question. The rhino farm or platinum farm started in 2008 with a clear sort of business venture in mind, in the hope of change of policy on rhino horn, to be able to legally trade the rhino horn, and obviously governed by CITES. It's legally tradable within South Africa's borders, but not international. So basically the whole venture was to amalgamate or amass a amount of numbers that could support a population of this size and just follow like a business model, which in theory failed, Ben. The project went up for auction on 2 or 3 occasions, and in April 2023, with it failing the last sort of auction that it went up, receiving no bids, we were approached by several sort of partners and stakeholders, both from government, NGO perspective, to see if we could come up with some sort of solution to the situation at hand, and I think African Parks is really, really sort of well placed to do this, because we understand what it is to manage these national parks on a continental scale, partnering with governments and local communities, but also in a massive attempt to basically de-risk the species, and that's how Rhino Rewild was born, knowing that there's 15% of the world's white rhino population in a single area, not really contributing ecologically into protected areas or into areas, and we basically sat around a table and said, you know what, We've got an imperative, a conservation imperative on us here to de-risk the species, and thus we kicked off the Rhino Rewild project.
So how did this guy behind Platinum Farm manage to amass 2,000 of one of the world's most endangered mammals? And when he did, were they just living like cows? Or was this like a dairy farm for rhinos?
So looking back at the way he obtained these rhinos, it was generally our national parks and provincial park systems used to auction rhinos off to sort of support the park functionality. So a lot of them were purchased through live auctions or live sales, both from government and private hands. And then I think that's one of the biggest sort of misperceptions around the rhino farm or the rhino project or whatever the case, Ben, is that it was like a sort of a habituated rhino paradise where you had rhino eating out of your hands, and that's not the case. These rhinos are all in sort of separate camps on the project site. It's a really, really well documented population with regards to genetics and the management there. But I think it is important to stress that it's like, often because of the number you think a rhino or a cow farm or a feedlot or whatever, but these rhinos rhinos, specifically currently speaking, they only supplement fed a certain portion of feed out of a certain time of year in the drier time. So it's pretty much a semi-wild rhino in the sense. The only difference is if a reserve has got, for argument's sake, one rhino per square kilometer, the farm would have a lot more rhino because of the nature and the history of the project.
So the idea that you guys came up with was to rescue these rhinos from that farm, take it all over, and then to take those rhinos in groups of several dozen at a time to protected areas that are principally under the management of African Parks, although not only, I saw that some of them went to the Kruger. Don, can you just give me an overview then about Rhino Rewild and what the kind of key pillars for success are?
So pillar number one is the rescue pillar, and that's exactly that. If organizations such as ourselves didn't step in with sufficient financial backing, these rhinos would have been at risk. A risk of one-off sales, fragmented sales into areas that have got sort of very limited sound management, and inevitably would have resulted in massive poaching and die-off. So we came in and we said, we're going to focus on the rescue component. That includes animal husbandry, security, continuing some of the good management practices that were in place to look after these rhino. And that would then link into pillar 2 and 3. And pillar 2 is the rewilding pillar of Rhino Rewild. And that's the active moving of the rhino to recipient areas. And I'll get into that process now quickly. And then the last component of the Rhino Rewild is the renew component. And obviously something that African Parks is really good at with regards to the protected area management, partnering with governments, partnering with communities and other NGOs in this space. But I think most importantly, where rhino is a keystone species, and an example like this is generally when an ecosystem or an area shows sort of weakness, rhino is the first animal to be removed out of that system, either through poaching or loss of habitat or whatever, and generally speaking, the last to return. So it's an indicator of successful, healthy ecosystems. And I think the important crux around the renew component is, if our protection is good enough to house rhino and look after rhino successfully, everything else under that banner sort of benefits from the protection thereof. Elephants, lion, ungulate species, you name it. So it dovetails quite nicely. It's important also to mention that African Parks has stepped into the space. We secured emergency funding. We've now secured funding to keep the project going for the foreseeable 10 years that we put out. But I think it's really important to mention that it's not a for African Parks by African Parks initiative. African Parks put up their hand for this audacious undertaking, which is, it's really hard work. The guys on the ground are on project site are working day and night to ensure that we've got animals that are in good condition to rewild them. But I think it's more important to mention the fact that it's around rhino, and our goal is to de-risk the species so that we're not in the same situation as we were with the northern white rhino, or if you take the southern white rhino 100 years ago, that we're not left with 50 individuals, but by doing pragmatic sort of due diligences on rewilding these rhino, that we establish core populations throughout the continent, which gives not only our rhino a fighting chance, but also contributes significantly to biodiversity on that, Ben.
Have some of these rhinos been rewilded in parks that are in countries that had previously lost all their rhinos?
Yes, Ben. So obviously South Africa, there's one or two reserves that we've augmented significant amounts where we were able to offset poaching losses over the past 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, recently, one of our biggest moves was to Garamba National Park in the DRC. A couple of years ago, we brought a small amount of rhino back in, and now we've brought subsequently probably 50 more rhino into that landscape, which was once a World Heritage Site as a result of the presence of northern white rhino in that place. So it's bringing a whole species back into those landscapes, and I think it highlights the fact, Ben, that with good governance, with good partnerships, with good management, and obviously substantial financial backing from our donors and support network, that we can, in a very pragmatic way, bring rhino back, reducing risk to bringing these species back. A project of this scale, a project that's taken this initiative, doesn't come without risk. We're very aware of the risks that it takes from moving a rhino to looking after a rhino, both internally in African parks and with partner reserves and conservation areas. And we try, to the best of our ability, mitigate those risks so that we do what's right for the rhino at the end of the day.
So African Parks is in 12 countries, 22 national parks, 20 million hectares that you as an organization are managing. Can you list for me where the rhinos are going to end up, these 2,000 rhinos from Platinum Farm?
Yeah, sure. So I think, Ben, the updated figure there is 24 national parks in 13 countries. So we've got Gambela in Ethiopia that the government has now partnered with us on. So I think it shows the potential and the growth and the scope of that. So I think within our portfolio, we can look. Last year we took rhinos to Akagera National Park in Rwanda. We've taken rhinos to DRC in Garamba, which we would potentially like to do again. And then I think the crux of the whole thing is that currently within our portfolio, there's a very small amount. We'd be looking at Chinko later on. We would definitely be keen on tabling the South Sudan conversation once things stabilize there and once we feel comfortable from a management perspective. But I think, again, stepping outside of just our park portfolio, I think the opportunity that we have here is partnering with both local, regional, and sort of continental countries. So basically, we discussing with Namibia a way forward on rhino there, with Botswana, with Eswatini, with Kenya, with Uganda. So I think there's a massive potential here with regards to the rhino, using rhino as a conduit to basically get a collective goal and vision on conservation efforts and come up with a continental solution. So while within our portfolio, it might not mean, a park such as Bazaruto or Iona National Park, they're never ever going to be able to house white rhino, and we're very aware of that. But I think there's a lot of other organizations out there. There's a lot of partner governments and organizations that are doing phenomenal work with regards to protection of white rhino, and we need to capitalize on that and partner with them on that for the sake of our project and our plans going forward.
So African Parks is working in some pretty difficult places. I've been invited by Peter Fernhead and some of the donors of African Parks to visit Zakuma and Enedi in Chad. And I got to admit, I'm slightly nervous given FCDO travel advice to go to Chad, but I'm very, very excited to see some of the wildest and most beautiful landscapes in Africa. But these are difficult places that in which African Parks works. And even in countries with better governance like Botswana and Kenya, South Africa, you've got rampant rhino poaching. So what's to say that the Rhino Rewild won't end up sending at least some rhinos to their deaths at the hands of poachers?
Yeah, and it's probably one of the more emotional questions that we have to answer, Ben, around this. Is that I think with the procurement of the rhino farm and the establishment of Rhino Rewild, we've really been cognizant around the risks associated with a project like that. And probably one of the biggest risks is we're moving these animals from a relatively secure area to areas where there's known activities around poaching and legal harvesting of array of species, not just rhino, So I think we've put a couple of measures in place around our due diligence, looking at security, looking at longevity, looking at the financial ability of the recipient to support the animals over a long-term period. But I think what's important to mention here, Ben, is that I don't think anywhere within our vision and our project have we had a caveat that says, yes, African Parks, we've got the solution for poaching, and we're going to drop these rhino off, and no rhino are going to be lost, either through disease, through complications, through translocation, through social issues, as well as anti-poaching or poaching issues. I think how we position ourselves in this is that we go through quite a lengthy process. So it's an application document. It's then assessments, habitat assessments, security assessments, management assessments, financial assessments. That then gets put onto an advisory committee where we've got the experts within the respective fields that weigh in on the risks and the potential dangers. We then sort of scrutinize the documentation on site. We then present that internally to African Parks, to our exco, where we again have similar discussions, and then only then do we either proceed or go back to the reserves with queries. Further to that, Ben, we've also got sort of contractual agreements where we've got certain off ramps in these agreements with our recipient areas. You know, understanding that a couple of rhino have been lost to poaching, and while it's hard for us, we can only imagine how hard it is for the recipient area. You know, there's guys, women and men that are dedicating their lives to the cause, and often we don't get it right. Often we do succumb to these instances, but with those processes and systems in place, and with our contract highlighting a couple of sort of off ramps, you know, if, for example, our contract states that if we lose 20% of the population that was reintroduced, we've either got the right to start the process again to look at maybe there's cracks that have occurred, maybe there's weaknesses, or we've got the right to take those rhino back and put them into an area that can look after them seemingly better. And I think those are the sort of measures we need to continue upholding, because we don't, I mean, the safety of rhino, the safety of elephant, lion, there's no silver bullet. You know, it's a combination of efforts, and it's a moving target. We constantly have to be adaptive. We constantly have to sort of try and get ahead of the game, and that's where the strength in the partnership comes from, that we work with reserves for the benefit of the species, and looking at it at a sort of a population level and not an individual level is really, really important for the long-term success here.
If you look at the available habitat remaining on the continent of Africa, and also habitat that could be restored, you know, areas that have been degraded one way or the other and could be rewilded, which is part of what African Parks does and what other organizations are doing. What could the future for rhinos in Africa be? I mean, how many could there be? And how important are these 2,000 rhinos to that process?
Yeah, so I think available habitat is plentiful. I don't think habitat is the biggest pressing thing. I think from our perspective, secure habitat is even more important than just available habitat. You know, there's an absolute imperative for us as a conservation community to act now. You know, one of the better quotes is what isn't protected today is lost tomorrow. You know, so I think we need to be absolutely direct and targeted in how we do this and how we go about those things. I think there's mistakes that have been made in the past that we can learn from, both internally in an organization and externally around conservation efforts that we can adapt and use going forward. But I think, I mean, obviously one of the cruxes around Project Rhino Rewild and this initiative is that it's a really positive sort of spin on rhino conservation and the potential that there is. I think if we carry on like this, growth will get to a point where we can sustain unintended losses as a population. Where habitats would come online because people want to be part of the initiative. People realize not just the economical value, but the ecological value that these rhinos play within the continent. And I think at large there's definitely a sort of a shift in that, Ben, where I think people have got common goals and common cause, and the common voice is starting to talk out. There'll always be nuances around the financial benefit and what the short term gain is, but I think the longer term gain on these, securing habitat, making sure that those areas are well protected, well managed, will without a doubt result into sort of larger numbers of rhinos, more secure populations, and that would obviously come with its challenges, because where do you go once you've reached your goal or your glass ceiling with rhino? But I think until then we need to put those measures in place, ensuring that we secure these habitats and protect them at all costs that we can, to ensure that these rhinos have got safe spaces to go to.
Do you think, Don, there could be hundreds of thousands of rhinos again in Africa? Is that unrealistic?
No, that's at least our hope, and that's why we do what we do.
What about millions?
Millions probably a bit of a stretch, Ben. Obviously, we need to be cognizant of other species, sort of grazing competition, habitat security, and that sort of thing. But I do think if we look at the trajectory of rhino and where it was going, we could definitely double up, if not triple up, on that from a continental perspective.
And in terms of the role they do play, these are big, heavy herbivores, and which certainly in a European context, which is the one I know best, are absolutely key to the functioning of ecosystems. Would you describe the rhino as a keystone species in that respect?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, shaping ecosystems, creating grazing lawns where rhinos are present. There's an increase in biodiversity. There's a offset of carbon reduction in bushfires or wildfires. So 100%. These animals have got a crucial role to play. And again, bringing up the case of Garamba, where a national park was a World Heritage Site just because of the presence of rhino. It just shows and emphasizes how important these animals are within the ecosystem.
And how far north were they? Were they ever up in the Sahel? Were they in North Africa historically?
Yeah, so I mean, northern whites sort of frequented that northern East Africa sort of area. But I think, Ben, the question here and the burning question is how long is a piece of string? How far up north were they? Depends on how far we go back. 100, 200 years ago, maybe not. 500, 1,000 years ago, a very strong possibility. I think we use major river sources as barriers for white rhino as our point of reference to today, but I think what one could think, with lower human presence, with more contiguous landscapes, it's sort of safe to assume, depending on how far back we go, that these animals would have frequented the continent, be it seasonally, be it sort of locally for a certain period of time, but definitely that they would have been all over the show.
Don, you're in charge of the logistics of moving these rhinos around. How do you move dozens, or in some cases more than 100, 2-ton rhinos across thousands of kilometers of remote African bush?
Yeah, it's not without its difficulties, Ben. So obviously, I mean, locally we usually track these rhinos. So we partner with a couple of organizations. So in this case, Conservation Solutions. They responsible for the translocation side of things, the physical move, and then we partner with Array, Wildscapes, veterinarian, and other veterinarian experts. But basically, locally we track these rhinos. So we'll use a helicopter, we'll use a veterinarian, we'll dart them, we'll load the animal into a crate, we put the crate on the truck, and off we go for the 12, 15, 18-hour drive. Continentally, a little bit more involved in the sense that we, like I mentioned, we've just done Garamba and overseen by Martin Rickleton, our sort of internal head of translocation. We took these animals from the rhino farm. We moved them into Pindar, which is a staging area, just to salt them a bit with regards to environmental conditions. We then drove these animals up to Johannesburg International, OR Tambo. We then loaded them onto a 747 Boeing. We then flew them into Entebbe. We then cross-loaded them from the Boeing onto C-130s. We then flew 4 flights of C-130s into Doko, into DRC in Garamba. We then offloaded them from the C-130s, put them on trucks, and then offloaded them at their final destination. So it's an astronomical undertaking that needs tons and tons of people. I mean, it's almost a support to weight ratio type scenario that we can say is that we need experts in all fields, logistics, permitting, to help us hands on deck. So it's a really complex process, Ben.
I helped set up an organization called the Pakistan Environment Trust a few years ago. And one of the key initiatives is known as Rewild Pakistan, run by Rabia Malik Shoaib, who's going to join as a guest on the podcast quite soon. And our principal project is to reintroduce rhinos to Pakistan, which is the greater one-horned rhino, the Asiatic rhinoceros. And they're going to come from Nepal, which is nothing as compared with the rest, which are going to come from Ohio, halfway around the world. That is being advised by the Aspinall Foundation and Rewild and other organizations. And the government of Pakistan is very excited about it. But I'll certainly put you in touch with Rabia as we get closer to the moment of moving these rhinos into Pakistan, a place that hasn't had rhinos for 400 years. It's quite an important part of their range because they're, of course, up in the Terai in Nepal and Bhutan, and they're, of course, in India. But they used to be in the valleys all the way across Afghanistan. They were much more widespread than they are today. Can we talk a little bit about African Parks? It's such an incredible organization. I think Peter Fernhead was the founder. What's the vision of African Parks?
Yeah, so I mean, our sort of goal that we've set out is 30 parks by 2030, so that we need to partner with governments, with communities to achieve this goal. It's a phenomenal organization that really looks after the interest of national assets. We partner with governments to manage these parks effectively and sort of walk a path with the government and community partners where applicable. So right now we're on the growth train. Like I mentioned, 24 parks in 13 different countries. We would, in the next sort of 4 years, we'd like to see that at 30 parks. The amount of countries is irrelevant, but sort of linking into the bigger picture thing of protecting 30% of the Earth's surface under that banner, and I think African Parks has grown. I mean, I've been with the organization for nearly 5 years now, and it's probably a dream organization and a dream job to have. You partnering and working with individuals that are probably the best and well versed in the respective fields, and it's just a phenomenal organization to work with and a phenomenal vision to be part of, Ben.
So if you go to an African country and make the offer, we will take on the management of this park, which is not being managed at all or very well at the moment. And you can see our track record as an organization. You can see how wildlife rebounds. You can see how local communities benefit from tourism and other revenues. Do those governments welcome you with open arms, and do they pay you to do that service for them?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, it is a service provision that we supply the government, but it's not one through compensation. So our sort of management is based on the 3M principle. So that means the mandate. So we have to have the mandate from the government, which allows us to do the management. And then obviously we have to have secured money, which we generally go and find. So either through philanthropic donor sort of support or institutional donor support. So it's a lot of the sort of governments that we work with have got trusted relationships with us now, where we've proved ourselves over the track record that you mentioned from 2000. plan. But I think the hard work is finding the financial stability or sustainability rather of these long-term agreements, because we go in there and we sign 20 years, 15 years with parks. It's not just a come and plug holes and leave. It's a building a basis from infrastructure management up to commercial community engagement, and then sort of ending in research, which boils down to helping management principles and practices. So it's a long road, Ben, to get to that point. But yeah, and again, I emphasize the fact it's partnerships that we have with governments rather than us coming in and saying we will now manage the park in such a way. We do it collectively with governments and communities, and obviously they're mostly guided by the national or the country legislation on how we implement management practices.
And the management of these parks under African Parks leadership can somewhat be paid for through revenues from nature tourism and potentially in the future nature-based carbon and so on. But fundamentally, you're reliant on the generosity of some very, very rich individuals. What will you do when those rich individuals die or find other priorities to focus on or lose interest or what have you?
Yeah, so I mean, again, very, very good question there, Ben. So taking a step back on how we categorize our parks quickly. So we've got 3 categories where a category 1 park like Akagera or Nyungwe can have the ability to generate its operational costs through local tourism or joint ventures. Category 2 park would be a 50-50 split where we would need 50% donor funding and 50% sort of community enterprises or joint ventures. And a category 3 park is a park that would simply never be able to, because of its location, because of external reasons, that would never be able to sort of generate that amount and would always rely on donor support. Now, I think one of the things that African Parks do really well is the transparency side of things. We realize that this philanthropic and institutional is trusted partnerships that are needed, and we always say internally in the organization, we have to be able to account for every single dollar at the end of the day, because it's donor dollar. We're working with other people's investors' money in something that they passionate about and they really believe. So there's an onus on us to do what we can with those dollars. I think the structures in African Parks where we've got fundraising teams sort of spread out in the Americas, in Europe, based in South Africa, and I think we're obviously always engaging with key partners and potential new partners. But I think most importantly is working with the current partners, ensuring that we are trusted with what we do, and basically building that longevity with them.
Don, you kind of glow with energy and enthusiasm. You must have a kind of dream job, and difficult, and it must be, and the amount of hours you have to put in, and the challenges that you face. This must be a dream job. I presume you grew up with a profound love of nature and wildlife.
I did, Ben, and I think it's worth mentioning. I'm very, very fortunate. I've been supported by a bunch of people to have the job that I have, but I think the credit and the thanks, I mean, for the short time that I'll be in the wheel here, and for as long as I'm entrusted with it, is that we work with an incredible team, from the guys on the ground at the Rhino Rewild project site, young guys that are coming through the mix, some of our section managers, our field operations manager, to head office, which is a phenomenal core group of people in Joburg, and extended to the sort of network that is African Parks, where we've got an environment where I can pick up the phone if I don't understand something, or I'm struggling to make sense of some stuff, that we can, within our network, just have that resource and institutional knowledge at our fingertips. So I've probably, I say, if you asked me 5 years ago, would I be sitting in a position like this, my answer was no, because this is something that Tony Park or Wilbur Smith would write chat about. But I think the backing that we've got as an organization, the support that we've got from donors and people who believe in us makes you pinch yourself every day, realizing that man, oh man, we've got an opportunity, and we're really, really fortunate and blessed to have the jobs we have.
Well, I have to pinch myself to convince myself that it's real, that you're running this Rhino Rewild program and reintroducing hundreds of rhinos to countries from which they've been extirpated a very, very long time ago. The challenges we face here in Great Britain, the home of the wildlife documentary, David Attenborough is our great hero. We're a wildlife loving people. It seems to me sometimes that the British love wildlife when it's on their television screens, or perhaps when they travel a long way abroad to see it, but not necessarily in their own backyard, because we're trying to reintroduce the Eurasian lynx to Britain. I'm involved with the Missing Lynx project in England, and there's a similar project in Scotland. And the kind of best estimate is it's going to take us years, 3 years, 5 years, maybe even 10 years to get a wildcat which is the size of my dog, the size of a Labrador, which doesn't hurt people, doesn't tend to take livestock, which is highly secretive. Now, to reintroduce that to the miles and miles of habitat we've got in the north of England and in Wales and in Scotland, the challenges are just beyond belief. And there you are, piling rhinos onto a 747 in Africa with hardly a care in the world. I'm envious of other countries that are able, and other continents that are able to do these kind of reintroductions, because we struggle so much here. Don, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you for allowing us to tell our side of the story, whatever small portion it may be.
I'm still just completely staggered by the audacity and the courage of an organisation like African Parks, buying up a bankrupt rhino farm with 2,000 rhinos, 15% of the world population, and then transporting them in Hercules aircraft to suitably prepared and protected areas across that continent. If you enjoyed the interview as much as I did, please do give us a like or a share on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. It all makes a big difference. Next time, I'm going to be talking about one of Europe's most fascinating and formerly abundant species, the European eel. It's really, truly an extraordinary creature that lives its life out in wetlands and rivers and then disappears far into the Atlantic to breed, a mystery that's only recently been unravelled, at around the same time that populations of this animal have collapsed. Well, I've got Joe Pecorelli from the Zoological Society of London to talk to me about what has happened with eels, how amazing they are, and how we're going to save them and restore them to their former abundance.